My parents called my 5-year-old a mistake, ripped my house key away, and threw us into a midnight snowstorm over spilled orange juice. I drove with shaking hands, nowhere to go. 3 hours later, someone knocked on their door, and my mother started screaming like she'd seen a ghost tonight. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm going to tell you exactly how orange juice turned into homelessness, and why the knock that came 3 hours later made my mother scream like she'd seen a ghost, because that part still doesn't sound real when I say it out loud, but I swear on my daughter's life it happened exactly like this. It was 10:45 p.m., the kind of late where the whole house feels like it's asleep on purpose, like the walls are quietly daring you to make a sound, and outside the snow was coming sideways like it had a personal vendetta against anything warm. My 5-year-old, Zoe, couldn't sleep. Not the cute toddler wants one more bedtime story thing. She was 5. She had a little personality, little opinions, and that wide-eyed fear kids get when they don't have the words, but they can feel something is wrong. She whispered from the dark, "I don't like the wind." And I whispered back, "It's just weather. Like weather cares about logic, like wind hears reason and decides to be gentle." The truth is, I wasn't comforting her. I was trying to calm myself, because waking my parents at night wasn't a normal sorry to bother you situation. It was like poking a bear and then pretending you didn't know bears bite. My parents didn't do inconvenient. They did punishment. And my house didn't feel like a home even when it was quiet. It was the tense kind of quiet, the kind that makes you walk softer, breathe softer, exist smaller, because you already know you're one wrong sound away from being treated like a problem again. I picked Zoe up, carried her down the hallway, and I moved like a thief in the place I was supposed to belong, flipping on the smallest kitchen light, just enough to see. I didn't turn on the big overhead light because in my parents' world, light meant disruption, and disruption meant blame. I poured Zoe a little cup of orange juice because it was the one thing that usually settled her, and I remember thinking, this is nothing, this is harmless. This is a tiny, peaceful solution, and that's the kind of thought that only exists right before a disaster. Because the second the juice hit the cup, I heard the stairs creak, the heavy, someone is already irritated creak, and then the door upstairs opened with a sigh that sounded like disgust. My mother appeared at the top of the stairs with that sharp, tired voice that wasn't actually about the moment. It was about me. "What are you doing?" I kept my voice low, respectful, small. "Zoe couldn't sleep. I'm just getting her something. Then we're going back." My sister Savannah showed up too, hair messy, face already annoyed like she'd been yanked out of a luxurious life by peasants. Savannah was 17, which is old enough to know better and young enough to enjoy cruelty when it benefits her. She squinted at Zoe like Zoe was a bug on her shoe. "Are you kidding me?" she hissed. "I have school. Some of us actually have plans." I apologized automatically, because that was our family religion. Apologize first. Explain never. I said, "I'm sorry. We'll be quick." Savannah stepped closer into the kitchen, arms folded, and she said calmly, like she'd rehearsed it, "Can you please just keep it down? It's late." Zoe's hands were small and clumsy and shaking. She reached for the cup, and her little fingers slipped. The cup tipped, and the orange juice spilled onto the carpet. One beat of silence, just one. And my brain did what it always did in that house. It went into panic fix mode. Towels. Paper towels. Clean it fast. Make it disappear. Like the real problem was the juice, and not the people waiting for an excuse. It was juice. Not acid. Not blood. Not some irreversible disaster. But the way my mother gasped, you'd think we'd set the place on fire. My father's footsteps hit the stairs hard enough to make the wood groan. Savannah's face went cold and disgusted. "Are you serious?" she said, like Zoe had personally declared war. I dropped to my knees with towels, talking fast, talking small, trying to shrink my presence. "It's okay. It's fine. I'll clean it. It was an accident." Zoe's lip trembled. She whispered, "I'm sorry." And I leaned close, wiped her cheeks, and whispered back, "Baby, it's okay. It's not your fault." But my father moved like he'd been waiting for this exact moment, like he'd been sitting in the dark just hoping for a mistake small enough to justify a big punishment. He came down the last step and said, "I'm done." My mother immediately backed him, like she always did. "This house is not a daycare. We are sick of your mess." I said, "I'll clean it, I swear. It was an accident. She's 5. Savannah added fuel because of course she did. She can't even control her own kid. My father's eyes flicked to Zoe for half a second, not like she was a child, like she was evidence. And then he said it, all of it, clean and sharp, like the sentence had been waiting on his tongue for years. "We are done raising your mistake. Get out and never come back." I swear my brain stalled. Like it couldn't process that adults, parents, could call a child a mistake with that kind of certainty, like they were labeling a stain. I stared at them from the floor with towels in my hands and orange juice seeping into the carpet like a crime scene, and I said, "Dad, it's snowing. It's a storm. Where are we supposed to go?" And he said, "I don't care." My mother didn't even look at me. She stared at the carpet like the carpet was the victim. That's what was so sick about it. They weren't shocked by their own cruelty. They were offended by inconvenience. I thought, they don't mean it, they'll cool down any second. My mom will sigh and say, "Fine, just tonight." Any second my dad will come to his senses, because surely there's a line, surely parents don't actually do this. Nobody stopped it. My dad grabbed bags like he'd practiced it in his head, like there was a checklist, and he'd been waiting for permission to finally use it. My mother yanked Zoe's coat off the hook and shoved it toward me like evidence. My father shoved a bag into my arms and then twisted the house key off my key ring like he was stripping me of a title. He curled it in his fist and said, "These aren't yours anymore." That moment hit harder than the yelling. Because it wasn't an argument anymore. It was eviction. I begged, and I hate that I begged, but when your child is standing there shaking and it's midnight and snow is screaming outside, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. I said, "Please, just let us stay tonight. I'll sleep in the car in the driveway. I'll do anything." Savannah's voice snapped, tight and satisfied. "You will not. You're not staying here." My mother didn't correct her. She didn't hesitate. My father opened the door. Cold punched into the hallway like a fist. Snow blew sideways into the entrance, like the storm had been invited inside. Zoe whimpered and pressed into my side. And then they pushed us out like we were trash that needed to be taken out before morning. The door shut. The lock clicked. That sound, that small final click, broke something in me more than the shouting ever could. Zoe started crying right away, full body shaking sobs, and she looked at the orange stain on her sleeve and whispered, "I'm sorry. It's my fault." I crouched down, wiped her cheeks with my thumbs, and forced my voice to stay steady, because mothers have to become walls when the world is trying to crush their kids. "No. No. Never your fault. Do you hear me? Never." Inside my head, panic screamed. I have no plan. I have no home. I have a child. And the porch light glared down on us like we were on display, like even the house wanted witnesses to our humiliation. I hauled the bags to my car, my cheap little car that was my only sliver of independence, and I got Zoe buckled in with hands shaking so badly, I fumbled the latch twice. My phone battery was low. My bank account was basically a joke. The kind of money that disappears the second you look at it. And I sat in the driver's seat for 1 second, staring at the snow, trying to think of a person who would answer a call that late, in that weather, and not treat us like a burden. And the horrible truth was, I couldn't think of one. I'd spent years being careful not to ask people for help because in my family help came with insults attached, and I'd learned to pretend I didn't need anything. So I started the car because sitting still felt like dying. I drove, aiming for the nearest place that meant lights and heat, a motel, a 24-hour diner, anywhere that wouldn't ask too many questions and wouldn't kick us out for being too sad. The road was slick. Snow came down hard. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle. Zoe sniffled in the back seat, voice small. "Where are we going?" And I lied bright, because that's what mothers do when reality is too heavy for a 5-year-old's bones. "An adventure," I said, and even saying it made my throat hurt. If you've ever had to fake calm while your whole life collapses, comment, I felt that, because that's exactly what it was, performance for survival. And right here, before what happens next, tell me where you're watching from, city and state if you're comfortable, because I swear the only thing that kept me from going completely numb that night was remembering there are people out there who understand what it feels like when family becomes the safest place to get hurt. I kept driving, hands locked around the wheel like I could steer my way out of my own life. And I was so focused on not sliding, on not dying, on not letting Zoe see me panic, that I didn't notice the other headlights until it was too late. Intersection.
Ice. A blur.
Another car slid in from the side. The impact hit hard enough to steal the air from my lungs. Zoe screamed, one sharp, terrified sound, and then she broke into sobbing. My whole world narrowed to one thing. Her. I twisted around, scanning her face, her arms, her legs, forcing my voice to sound calm, even though my heart was trying to claw out of my throat. Talk to me, baby. Look at me. Are you hurt? Where do you hurt?
She shook her head hard, crying.
I'm scared. No blood. No obvious injury. Just fear. Loud and real. Snow hissed across the windows. And then I saw a woman stepping through the storm toward my car, steady, controlled, not panicking. She looked into my back seat, saw Zoe's tear-streaked face, saw the bags, saw the whole picture, and instead of screaming at me about the bumper like a normal person, she asked one quiet question that made my stomach drop. Why are you out in this weather with a 5-year-old? I tried to lie, I really did, because lying is what you do when you're ashamed and you've been trained to protect other people's reputations at your own expense, but my mouth betrayed me. We got kicked out, I heard myself say. Tonight. Her face changed like she'd been slapped by that sentence. She asked, "What's your name?" "Clara," I said, voice shaking. And then she said my last name like she already knew it, like she was checking a memory she didn't want to be true. Clara Walker. My blood ran cold. Because strangers don't know your last name in a snowstorm. And the way she said it wasn't casual. It was personal. Zoe sniffled behind me, whispering, "Mommy, are we going home?" And I couldn't answer that question because I didn't know what home even meant anymore. The woman's eyes flicked to Zoe again, quick and careful, checking seatbelt, cheeks, hands, like she'd done this before, or at least like she took a child's safety personally. She asked, "Is she hurt?" "No," I said too fast. "Just scared." She nodded once like she filed the information away. Then I blurted, "I'm sorry, I didn't see you. The road was—" She cut through it gently but firmly, like she wasn't interested in blaming the wrong thing. "It's a bumper," she said. "Don't worry about it." That should have been comforting, but it was almost more unsettling, because who doesn't worry about a crash? Who doesn't yell? Who walks up in a storm and focuses on the child first? I stared at her, and my brain kept circling the same thought. She knows me. But from where? She leaned closer so Zoe could see her face and she said, "Hi, sweetheart. What's your name?" Zoe hesitated and looked at me like she needed permission to speak in a world where speaking could get you in trouble. I said, "Zoe." The woman nodded.
"Hi, Zoe.
I'm Simona." Then she looked at me again, and her voice got even calmer, like she was making a decision that didn't require my approval. "Clara, where were you headed?" I swallowed. "A motel?" I said, and it sounded pathetic the second it left my mouth. She didn't pity me. She didn't soften her face into that fake sympathy people do when they're relieved it isn't them. She just said, "And after that?" My throat tightened. "I don't know." And there it was. The truth I'd been trying not to speak. "I don't know." She watched me for a beat, then said, "Okay, you're not driving anywhere else tonight." I started to protest because pride is stupid and survival is smarter. "I have to." "I don't have," she cut in, still calm. "I heard you. You don't have anywhere. That's why you're not driving." She pointed toward a nearby parking lot. "Hazards on.
Pull in slow.
I'll follow you." I wanted to argue. I wanted to pretend I was fine. But Zoe whispered, "Mommy." And the way she said it sounded like she was holding on to me like a lifeline. So I flicked my hazards on and pulled into the lot with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. Simona parked behind us. She got out, Took 2 quick photos of the bumpers and the intersection like she was handling logistics, not drama, and then she opened her back door and pulled out a blanket. Not theatrics. Just action. She spread it across her back seat and opened the door for Zoe. "Come sit here," she said softly. "We're getting warm." Zoe stared at her, then looked at me for permission. I nodded. "It's okay, baby." Zoe climbed in, clutching her coat, and her breathing finally slowed like warmth was reminding her she was still alive. Simona handed me my dropped bag like it wasn't a big deal. "Lock your car," she said. I did, and that little click sounded so small for the kind of night we were living. Then I slid into the front seat of Simona's car, and as she drove us through the snow toward a modest house with warm lights, my brain finally caught up to the one terrifying thought I'd been avoiding since she said my name. How does she know me, and why does it feel like my parents are about to learn that throwing me out didn't just ruin my life, it exposed theirs? If you're already angry on Zoe's behalf, good. You should be, so comment they crossed the line, because what happens next is where the real trap starts closing, and you're going to see exactly why that knock at their door made my mother scream. The drive to Simona's house felt unreal, like I'd slipped into someone else's life for a moment, because heat came back into my fingers and Zoe's crying softened into sniffles, and my brain didn't know how to exist without panic screaming in the background. We pulled into a quiet neighborhood, the kind where the snow looks gentler because the streetlights are warm and steady, not flickering, and Simona parked like this was the most normal thing in the world. She didn't rush, didn't hover, didn't ask me a million questions. She just opened her door, grabbed Zoe's blanket again, and said, "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you inside." And here's the thing that messed with my head the most.
Zoe went.
No fear. No hesitation. Because kids can tell when an adult isn't dangerous. Kids know when someone's voice doesn't carry threat underneath it. Zoe held my hand, but she leaned slightly toward Simona, like her body already knew we weren't in trouble anymore. The house itself wasn't fancy. That mattered. It wasn't one of those cold, echoing houses that feel like museums where you're afraid to sit on anything. It was warm. Lamps instead of overhead lights. A lived-in couch. Shoes by the door. The kind of home where nothing is screaming perfect, but everything whispers safe. The second the door shut, the heat wrapped around us, and Zoe sagged like her body had been held together by adrenaline alone. Simona knelt in front of her, right down at eye level, and said, "Can I get you some hot chocolate?" Zoe looked at me again, checking. I nodded, throat tight. "Yeah, baby," Zoe whispered. "With marshmallows?" And Simona smiled, not fake, not patronizing. "I think we can make that happen." That was the moment my chest started to hurt, because nobody in my parents' house ever bent down to Zoe's level. Nobody asked her what she wanted. She was always treated like noise that needed managing. Simona handed her a mug with both hands like it was important, and Zoe wrapped her fingers around it and took the tiniest sip like she was afraid it might disappear. I stood there still wearing my coat, bags at my feet, body rigid, waiting for the catch. Because kindness in my life had always come with a bill later. Simona noticed immediately. "You can take your coat off," she said gently. "You're not in trouble." That sentence almost broke me. I sat on the edge of the couch instead, still braced because sitting fully back felt like claiming space I wasn't sure I was allowed to take. Zoe curled up beside me, her head on my thigh, and for the first time since the porch, her breathing slowed all the way down. Simona disappeared into the kitchen and came back with socks, a throw blanket, and a phone charger like she'd done this before for someone, somewhere. She plugged my phone in without asking. "Battery anxiety doesn't help anyone," she said lightly. And then she finally looked at me properly, not like a stranger, but like someone recognizing a face from a memory that never really left. "Clara," she said quietly. "It's me." My stomach dropped through the floor. Because now the pieces slammed together all at once. Her posture. Her voice. The way she spoke to Zoe. "Dr. Carr," I whispered. "Simona Carr. My mentor. The only adult who ever looked at me like I wasn't a problem that needed managing. The one person years ago who had asked me what I wanted to be instead of what I'd done wrong." Zoe yawned and slid sideways against the couch, already half asleep, completely unaware that my entire past had just collided with my present in the most violent, surreal way possible. Simona kept her voice low. "I haven't seen you since you stopped coming," she said. Not accusing. Not disappointed. Just stating a fact. "I tried to find you." I swallowed hard. "Life happened," I said, which was the laziest summary of trauma imaginable, but it was all I had in that moment. She didn't push. She didn't pry. She nodded like she understood that sentence carried weight. "Is Zoe okay?" she asked instead. "Physically, yes," I said. Emotionally, I didn't finish because I didn't know how. Simona glanced at Zoe, already asleep now, her face soft in a way I hadn't seen all night. "We'll handle tonight first," she said. "The rest can wait." That sentence mattered more than she knew. Because my parents never let the rest wait. Everything was always urgent. Always your fault. Always now. She asked me what was still in the house that we needed, and my brain answered automatically because survival had kicked in. My wallet. Zoe's school papers. And my EpiPen. Shellfish allergy. That last part finally cracked her calm. Just slightly. "No," she said, firm but quiet. "We're not gambling with that." She called non-emergency police without drama, explained it like a logistics problem instead of a family war, and asked for a civil standby to retrieve essential items. And while she was on the phone, my own phone lit up.
Dad.
Then Mom. Back to back. I stared at the screen like it might bite me. Simona didn't say anything. She didn't tell me what to do. She just stayed close, present, like backup I'd never had. I answered because I was tired of running. My dad's voice exploded immediately. "What did you do?" "We had police at our door in the middle of the night." My mom jumped in, furious. "Do you know how this looks? Calling police on your own parents." The old reflex tried to take over. Apologize.
Shrink.
Explain. But then I looked at Zoe asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, finally safe, and something inside me snapped clean instead of breaking messy. "I called because I needed my EpiPen," I said. "That's it." My dad scoffed. "Always a story." I didn't argue.
I didn't justify.
I said, "I'm hanging up," and I did. The silence afterward felt heavy but powerful, like stepping out of a storm and realizing the rain can't touch you anymore. When the officer came later with my things, he asked the standard questions. "Are you safe? Is the child safe?" And hearing those words from a stranger hit different than hearing, "What did you do wrong?" from family. When the door closed again, the house felt quiet in a way that wasn't threatening. The quiet after survival, not the quiet before punishment. Simona asked if I was hungry, and I almost laughed because my life had just imploded and my body still needed food like it was rude not to. She made soup. Not instant.
Soup.
The kind that simmers. Zoe woke up just enough to eat a few spoonfuls before passing out completely. I tucked her in on the couch, watching her chest rise and fall, and my knees almost gave out from the relief. Simona looked at me and said, "You can stay here." I started to say, "Just for tonight," because that's what people like me are trained to say, but she cut that off gently. "Until you're stable," she said. "Until you're safe." Zoe murmured in her sleep, "We're staying." And I whispered back, "Yes, baby." And that word, yes, felt like a promise I could finally keep. The next morning didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm after a fire, when everything still smells like smoke and you're waiting to see what didn't survive. Zoe slept like she hadn't slept in months. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright, dressed, staring at my phone, waiting for the explosion. It didn't come. Simona slid a mug of coffee toward me like it was medicine. She didn't coddle. She didn't lecture. She asked practical questions. "Where do you work?" "Grocery store." "Early mornings." "You missed today."
Yeah.
"We'll call." She put it on speaker, so I couldn't hide. I explained. "Weather. Emergency. Tomorrow." My manager grumbled, but kept my shift. That tiny wind loosened something in my chest. Zoe patted in, rubbing her eyes, scanning the room like it might disappear. "We're still here?" she asked. "We're still here," I said. She nodded, satisfied. Then she asked the question that stabbed me. Are they still mad? I didn't say the truth, which was that my parents didn't have a mad setting, they had a permanent disappointment setting. I said, we're safe. And she accepted that like kids do, because safety is a language they understand deeply. After I dropped Zoe at school, I came back to Simona's kitchen and stood there waiting for the other shoe to drop. She looked at me and said, "You don't have to wear that face here." I laughed once, sharp. Old habit. She nodded like she understood old habits very well. Then she asked the question I didn't know I'd been waiting years to hear. Do you want to finish school? My chest tightened. I work. I have a kid. You're smart, she said calmly. And you're not too late. That sentence was rebellion. Quiet rebellion. The kind that doesn't shout but changes everything. She slid a notepad across the table. A plan. Not hope. Not inspiration.
Steps. Hours. Nights.
If you fail?
I asked.
Then you take it again, she said, like failure wasn't a moral judgment. That was the moment it stopped feeling like rescue and started feeling like a future. And right here, pause with me for a second and tell me where you're watching from, because I need you to understand something before this goes any further. What my parents did that night wasn't just cruel. It set off a chain of events they never saw coming. And the next knock on their door wasn't from police or pity. It was from consequences. And when they finally realized who Simona was and what she represented, the power dynamic flipped so hard it rattled the entire family. Stay with me, because the next phase is where survival turns into something they never expected from me at all. The days after that morning blurred together in a way that felt unreal, like my life had been quietly swapped out while I wasn't looking, because nothing exploded the way I expected it to, and that alone was terrifying. I kept waiting for my parents to show up, to bang on the door, to scream about embarrassment and disrespect and how I was ungrateful and dramatic, but the house stayed calm, and the silence wasn't empty, it was observant, like something was watching and waiting. My routine shifted without ceremony. Work in the mornings, Zoe's school drop-off, afternoons at Simona's kitchen table, where the surface still bore tiny scratches from years of use, evenings where Zoe colored beside me while I stared at pages that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. At first, my hands shook every time I opened a book, because learning again felt dangerous, like stepping back into a version of myself my parents had worked very hard to erase. Every equation, every paragraph triggered a voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my father saying, "You're not that smart," and my mother saying, "This isn't practical," and Savannah laughing like my ambition was a joke told at my expense. Simona never argued with those voices. She didn't tell me to think positive or believe in myself. She just said things like, "Read the next paragraph, and let's break that problem into smaller pieces, and you don't have to be confident to be consistent." That mattered because confidence had always been conditional in my life, but consistency was something I could control. Zoe adjusted faster than I did. Kids always do. She learned where the cups were, where the bathroom was, which blanket was hers. She started calling Simona Miss Carr, and then, without anyone correcting her, shortened it to Mona. Like closeness just happened naturally when you weren't punished for existing. Watching that did something strange to my chest. I'd spent years apologizing for Zoe's presence, teaching her to be quiet, to take up less space, to not bother people. Now she laughed again. She asked questions without whispering. She slept through the night. That alone told me everything I needed to know about the house we'd been thrown out of. My parents, meanwhile, stayed quiet. No calls. No messages. Nothing. And that silence wasn't peace, it was strategy. I'd lived with them long enough to recognize it. They weren't done. They were recalculating. And then the first crack appeared, not in a dramatic way, but through Savannah. She messaged me late one night, not angry, not apologetic, just curious in a way that felt invasive. "Mom says you're staying with some lady from your past. Is that true?" I stared at the screen for a long time before answering, because every instinct in me wanted to explain, to justify, to soften it so it wouldn't provoke backlash. Instead, I typed, "Yes." Nothing else. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. You really embarrassed them, she sent finally. Dad's furious. That familiar pressure started to rise in my chest, the old reflex to make things better by sacrificing myself. But then Zoe laughed from the couch over something on TV, and the sound grounded me. I typed back. I didn't embarrass them. They did that themselves. Savannah didn't reply. That was new. A week later, the school called. Not Zoe's school. My old high school. They were doing transcript verifications for adult learners and needed confirmation on some records. The woman on the phone sounded confused. It looks like you were withdrawn without graduation. Do you know why? I almost laughed, because how do you explain to a stranger that your parents erased your education to protect their image? Family decision, I said instead. After I hung up, I sat at the table staring at my hands, realizing something important. Everything my parents did had been about control. Control of the story. Control of appearances.
Control of me.
And the moment I left their house with Zoe, that control started slipping. Simona noticed the shift in me before I did. One night after Zoe fell asleep, she poured tea and sat across from me, not as a mentor, not as a rescuer, but as someone who respected me enough to tell the truth. They're going to reach out, she said calmly. Not because they miss you. Because they're losing leverage. My stomach dropped. What does that look like? I asked.
She didn't hesitate.
Guilt first. Then anger. Then concern. Then bargaining. She smiled faintly. It's a predictable pattern. Hearing it laid out like that stripped it of its power. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. And right on schedule, my mother called. Not screaming. Not crying.
Soft.
Concerned. Clara, sweetheart, we've been worried sick, she said, like she hadn't locked us out in a snowstorm. We just want to make sure Zoe is okay. I felt the old pull, the urge to let her rewrite history, to pretend this was a misunderstanding instead of abandonment. I looked at Simona, who said nothing, just watched. Zoe is fine, I said evenly. She's safe. Well, of course she is, my mother replied quickly. Because we raised you right. That was the hook. That was the lie she needed me to agree to, so the rest of the conversation could continue. You raised me to survive, I said. Silence. Then the crack in her voice. We were just overwhelmed. You know how things get. I almost asked how orange juice turned into homelessness, but I didn't. I said, you told me my daughter was a mistake. Another pause. Longer. You're holding on to things, she said finally. Families forgive. Families don't throw 5-year-olds into storms, I replied, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. She hung up shortly after. No apology. No accountability.
Just retreat.
And that's when it hit me. They weren't calling to fix anything. They were calling to see if the door was still unlocked. It wasn't. Weeks passed. I passed my first GED practice exam. Zoe taped the score to the fridge like it was a trophy. Simona didn't celebrate loudly. She just nodded once and said, good. Keep going. That quiet confidence did more for me than praise ever could. I started to feel something unfamiliar. Stability. Not happiness.
Not joy. Stability.
The kind that lets you breathe without flinching. One afternoon, as Zoe colored and I studied, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked older than I remembered, but stronger, like someone who'd been carrying weight and finally learned how to distribute it instead of collapsing. And right here, pause with me for a second and tell me where you're watching from, because I want you to understand something before this escalates. The calm you're seeing now isn't the end. It's the eye of the storm. Because my parents didn't just lose control over me. They lost control over the narrative. And the moment other people started seeing the truth, things got ugly fast. The next contact didn't come from my family. It came from someone who had power, receipts, and no emotional attachment to protect them. And when that happened, everything they'd built their image on started to crack. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change my life. It exposed theirs in ways they never saw coming. The shift didn't announce itself with a bang. It arrived disguised as paperwork, the kind people underestimate because it doesn't scream, it just waits, and the first sign was a certified envelope that showed up in Simona's mailbox with my name printed cleanly across the front like someone wanted proof I'd received it. I remember holding it longer than necessary, feeling the weight of it, because envelopes like that never carry good news, they carry consequences. Inside wasn't a threat, not directly, it was a request, formal language wrapped around something sharp, asking for clarification regarding an unusual withdrawal from secondary education tied to a family guardianship decision made years earlier. I read it twice before it fully landed. This wasn't my parents calling to guilt me. This wasn't Savannah testing the waters. This was an institution asking questions my parents had never expected anyone to ask. That's when it clicked. My parents had controlled me because no one else had ever looked closely enough to question them. Their authority worked in private, in kitchens and hallways and whispered conversations that never left the house. Now it was being examined under fluorescent lights by people whose job wasn't to preserve feelings, it was to document facts. I felt something I hadn't felt since the night we were locked out. Fear mixed with relief. Fear because systems are unpredictable. Relief because systems don't care about family loyalty. They care about records. Simona saw my face before I said a word. She took the letter, read it once, then nodded slowly like someone confirming a theory. They flagged the withdrawal, she said. Which means someone's looking at who authorized it and why. My stomach flipped. Am I in trouble? I asked, because that's what you ask when you've been trained to assume blame. She shook her head.
No.
You were a minor. If anything, this puts the spotlight exactly where it should have been all along. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared of what would happen to me, but because I could finally see the shape of what had been done to me, and it was bigger than one argument, bigger than one stormy night, bigger than orange juice on carpet. It was systematic. Intentional. My parents hadn't just punished me. They'd erased options. And erasure leaves tracks. The next week turned into a quiet interrogation of the past. Phone calls. Emails. Requests for timelines. I dug through old folders and found report cards, acceptance letters, a faded brochure from the scholars program my parents had yanked me out of like it was contraband. Every document felt like proof that the life I'd been told I threw away had actually been taken from me. Zoe watched me sorting papers and asked, "Are these from when you were little?" I nodded. "From when I was learning," I said. She considered that seriously, then said, "You're still learning." I laughed, but it stuck because she was right. Learning hadn't stopped. It had just been delayed. Meanwhile, my parents noticed the silence from me wasn't temporary. My mother tried a new tactic. She showed up at Zoe's school. Not inside, not dramatic, just hovering at dismissal, like she belonged there.
I wasn't there that day.
Simona had offered to pick Zoe up, so I could attend a meeting tied to the letter. The school called Simona immediately because she was listed as emergency contact. When Simona arrived, calm and unbothered, my mother put on her concerned grandmother voice and said, "I was just checking in." Clara's been distant. Simona didn't match her tone. She didn't escalate. She just said, "You're not authorized for pickup." That was it. No argument. No emotion. Authority doesn't need volume. My mother left, but not before making sure the secretary heard her sigh, heavy and theatrical, like she'd been wronged. When Simona told me later, something inside me settled. Not because my mother had tried again, but because she'd failed. She couldn't bypass boundaries anymore. She didn't have access. And access had always been her weapon. Then Savannah called. Not texted.
Called.
I answered because curiosity finally outweighed dread. Her voice was different. Tighter. Less smug. "What did you do?" she asked without greeting. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "Then why are people calling Mom?" There it was. Exposure. "Because they're asking questions," I said. "About things that happened when I was a minor." She went quiet. Then softer. "They're saying Mom and Dad could get in trouble." I almost said they should have thought of that, but I didn't. Instead I said, they made decisions. Decisions have consequences. Savannah scoffed weakly. "You always have to make everything dramatic."
I almost laughed.
No, I said calmly. I survived drama. This is documentation. She hung up. 2 days later, the follow-up letter arrived. This one wasn't a request. It was a notice. An inquiry had been opened into whether educational neglect had occurred. I sat at the table reading it while Zoe ate cereal and asked me to quiz her spelling words. Life continuing alongside justice felt surreal. I expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching a story I'd lived finally get the right subtitles. My parents, on the other hand, spiraled. My father left a voicemail, so long it cut itself off, full of words like betrayal and ungrateful and how dare you drag strangers into family business. My mother sent an email titled, "This isn't what we raised you for," outlining how much they'd sacrificed, how much they'd protected me, how much shame I'd brought back into their lives. I didn't respond. Silence was no longer a punishment. It was a boundary. In the middle of all this, something unexpected happened. I started to feel powerful. Not loud power. Not revenge movie power. Quiet power. The kind that comes from not being confused anymore. For the first time, I wasn't questioning my memory or my worth. I had timelines, records, witnesses, truth that didn't require belief. And that's dangerous to people who rely on gaslighting. If you're still with me right now, pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next proved something I wish I'd known earlier. When control is built on silence, the moment someone speaks clearly, everything starts to crack. The inquiry moved faster than I expected. Simona explained why. Mandatory reporters don't like gray areas. They like answers. And my parents' answers didn't line up. They claimed I chose to leave school. The records showed otherwise. They claimed it was temporary. The dates said permanent. They claimed it was for my protection. The program coordinator remembered my disappearance and the unanswered calls. Someone else remembered my mother's insistence that it was handled. Each memory stacked like bricks. Meanwhile, my life kept inching forward. I passed another exam. I got a better shift at work. Zoe started bringing home artwork labeled Mom's House, with a little stick figure that looked suspiciously confident. Simona watched me balance textbooks and lunches and meetings like I'd been doing it my whole life and said one night, "You know this isn't luck, right?" I shrugged. "Feels like it." She shook her head. "Luck doesn't look like this. This is resilience." I didn't know what to do with that word yet. It felt too big. Then the call came. Not from my parents. From an investigator. Calm voice. Neutral questions. "Can you describe the night you were asked to leave the house?" I described it without emotion, because emotion wasn't necessary. Facts were enough. "Did you have access to transportation?" "Yes." "Did you have alternate housing arranged?" "No." "Were you provided resources?"
"No."
When the call ended, I sat in silence, hands steady. That surprised me most. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't small. I was clear. My parents found out before I could tell Zoe anything because my mother showed up at Simona's house unannounced. This time, she was crying. Real tears or not, I didn't care. She demanded to see me. Simona didn't let her in. She stood on the porch and said, "You need to leave." My mother shouted about family, about how I was destroying everything, about how Savannah was suffering because of me. I stood behind the door listening, heart pounding, not because I wanted to run, but because this was the first time I didn't open it. Eventually, she left. The next morning, Savannah texted one sentence. "Mom says if anything happens to them, it's on you." I stared at it, then deleted it. Because guilt only works if you accept responsibility for choices you didn't make. And here's the truth that settled in my bones during those weeks. My parents weren't scared because they loved me. They were scared because someone finally saw them. And exposure doesn't care about intention. It cares about impact. As the inquiry continued, I realized something else. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about acknowledging that what happened to me mattered. That erasing a future has weight. That throwing a child and her child into a storm isn't discipline, it's harm. And harm leaves records. By the time the letter came confirming the findings, I wasn't surprised. Educational neglect substantiated. Recommended interventions. No dramatic arrests. No movie ending. Just accountability written in black and white. My parents didn't call after that. Not once. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't waiting. It was retreating. And standing in the kitchen that night, Zoe asleep down the hall, I realized something that stopped me cold. I didn't feel empty without them. I felt finished. Not healed. Not untouched. Finished with the question of whether I'd imagined it. Finished with chasing validation from people who only valued control. And as I packed away the letters and closed the folder, I knew something else too. This wasn't the end of the story. Because consequences don't always arrive all at once. Sometimes they unfold slowly, in public, where everyone can see them. And the next chapter didn't belong to me alone. It belonged to the people who'd spent years pretending I didn't deserve one. What I didn't expect after the findings became official was how fast the world around my parents started behaving like it finally had permission to remember. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle and far more unsettling. People who had once nodded politely at them stopped lingering in conversations. Invitations thinned out. The kind of social insulation that comes from appearing respectable began to peel away layer by layer. My parents had always relied on reputation like armor, believing that as long as they looked right from the outside, no one would ever question what happened behind closed doors. But systems don't care about optics, and once the record existed, it followed them like a shadow they couldn't shake. I heard about it secondhand at first, through Savannah's friends who still talked to Zoe's classmates' parents, through a neighbor who mentioned to Simona that my mother seemed off lately, through the school counselor who quietly asked if Zoe was adjusting well given recent family changes. No one said my parents' names out loud in accusations, but the air around them shifted, and when you've spent your life watching people manage appearances, you can tell when control is slipping. At the same time, something else was happening to me, something quieter but more profound. I stopped flinching when the phone rang. I stopped rehearsing apologies before conversations even started. The hypervigilance I'd mistaken for maturity began to loosen its grip, and that terrified me more than fear ever had, because fear at least felt familiar. Calm felt like standing on new ground without knowing if it would hold. One night, after Zoe had fallen asleep with her homework half finished on the table, I sat alone scrolling through messages I hadn't opened from extended family members, people who suddenly wanted to check in, now that the story was no longer containable. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because I realized something crucial. I didn't owe anyone a performance of healing. I didn't need to narrate my pain to justify my boundaries. Silence, when chosen, is different from silence when imposed. And that distinction felt like oxygen. A week later, my father broke his own silence. He showed up at my workplace just before closing, standing stiffly near the checkout like a man who still believed proximity granted authority. My manager looked at me, confused, and I nodded because I was done hiding. We stepped outside into the parking lot under harsh fluorescent lights that flattened everything. He didn't start with an apology. He never did. He started with blame disguised as concern. He said the investigation had put stress on the family. He said Savannah was struggling. He said my mother couldn't sleep. He said neighbors were whispering. And then, like it was a logical conclusion, he said, "Was it worth it?" I remember looking at him and realizing I wasn't angry. I was curious. Curious how a grown man could still believe that my survival was negotiable. I asked him one question. What part of throwing a child and her child into a snowstorm did you think wouldn't eventually matter? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have a script for that. He shifted tactics, told me I was rewriting history, that parents make hard decisions, that I was too young to understand then, and too emotional to understand now. That's when I felt it, the old trap trying to snap shut. The urge to explain, to justify,
To shrink.
and for the first time it didn't work. I told him calmly, "You don't get access to me anymore." Not as a threat, as a statement. He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, and said, "You think you can just cut us off?" I answered honestly, "I already did. You're just noticing now." He left without another word, and I stood there shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of doing something my nervous system had been trained to believe was impossible. That night, I cried hard, the kind of crying that comes after you've held your breath for years and finally exhale all at once. Zoe came out of her room and climbed into my lap, wrapping her arms around my neck like she'd done since she was little. "Are you sad?" she asked. I told her the truth, simplified but real. "I'm letting go of something that hurt me." She nodded like that made perfect sense, then said, "Okay," and rested her head against my chest. In that moment, I understood something about cycles. They don't break with speeches. They break with choices that feel uncomfortable at first and peaceful later. Around this time, the letters stopped coming, the calls dried up, and the noise faded into a background hum I could ignore. Life didn't become magically easy. Bills still existed. Deadlines still loomed. Some days I felt like I was building a house one brick at a time with hands that were still sore from demolition. But there was momentum now, and momentum is intoxicating when you've spent years stuck. I started sleeping through the night. Zoe started laughing louder. Even Simona commented one morning that the house felt lighter, like tension had finally moved out. Halfway through one particularly long night of studying, I paused and realized something else had changed. I wasn't proving anything anymore. Not to my parents. Not to institutions. Not even to myself. I was living. And that's when it hit me that the real consequence for my parents wasn't the investigation or the whispers or the discomfort. It was irrelevance. They no longer had a role in my decisions, my growth, my identity. They'd lost the audience they thought they owned. If you're still here with me, take a second and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next only made sense once I understood how deeply people fear losing control over the narratives they built their lives around. It started with Savannah, quietly this time. She sent a message that wasn't angry or accusatory. It just said, "I don't know who we are without you being the problem."
I stared at it for a long time.
There it was. The truth no one had ever admitted. My role hadn't been daughter. It had been distraction. I typed, erased, retyped, then finally sent one sentence. "You'll have to figure that out without hurting someone else." She didn't reply. And I didn't chase. Because growth doesn't require an audience, and healing doesn't need consensus. As weeks turned into months, the story stopped feeling raw and started feeling instructive. Not in a preachy way, but in a grounded, lived-in way. I noticed how often people confuse endurance with virtue, how many families call control love, how many parents think providing shelter excuses emotional abandonment. I noticed how often survivors are told to forgive quickly for the comfort of others. And I noticed how powerful it was to simply refuse. Not with rage, not with theatrics, but with clarity. One evening, as I tucked Zoe into bed, she asked me a question that landed heavier than any confrontation. "Mom," she said, "if someone says I'm a mistake, what do I do?" I didn't answer right away. I chose my words carefully because I knew they'd echo longer than any lecture. I said, "You don't argue with people who decide you're wrong for existing. You build a life so full that their opinion doesn't fit inside it." She smiled sleepily and said, "Okay," like that was a plan she could trust. And lying there in the dark afterward, I realized something that still sends a chill through me. My parents thought the night they kicked us out was the end of their responsibility. In reality, it was the beginning of their consequences. And the story wasn't finished yet because when control collapses, it doesn't fall quietly. It looks for something else to cling to. And next, that desperation was going to surface in a way none of us expected. What I didn't anticipate was that once control slipped through their fingers, my parents didn't retreat quietly, they escalated sideways, the way people do when they can't dominate the person they want anymore, and start trying to dominate the story instead, and I started seeing it in fragments before it fully revealed itself. Small ripples that didn't make sense until they stacked on top of each other and formed something ugly and intentional, like the way my mother suddenly began reaching out to people she hadn't spoken to in years, cousins, old church acquaintances, former neighbors, not to apologize or reconcile but to express concern about me, concern wrapped in just enough sweetness to sound reasonable, concern that painted me as unstable, overwhelmed, manipulated by outside influences, concern that never mentioned the snowstorm or the lockout or the words mistake and never come back, concern that conveniently erased the night they'd tried to erase me, and at first I laughed it off because growth gives you this false confidence that you're immune to nonsense. But then the calls started coming in, not angry calls, worse, worried ones, the kind that open with "I just want to make sure you're okay," and end with carefully placed questions about whether I was getting help, or being influenced, or keeping Zoe from her grandparents out of spite. And that's when I understood the strategy. Because my parents didn't need me back. They needed me discredited. They needed the narrative to shift from parents who crossed a line to daughter who overreacted, because if they could frame my boundaries as cruelty, their behavior could be rebranded as concern, and I'd lived with them long enough to recognize that move instantly. It was the same one they used when Savannah cried, when teachers asked questions, when relatives noticed bruises on walls instead of bodies. Redirect, soften, reframe, always make themselves the reasonable ones and the child the problem. And I won't lie, it rattled me, not because I believed them, but because I knew how effective that tactic could be when aimed at people who only see the polished version of a family and assume abuse always looks like shouting and broken bones instead of quiet erasure and conditional love. And I remember sitting at Simona's table one night, my phone buzzing again, and feeling that old familiar knot in my chest. The one that whispered, maybe you should just explain yourself. Maybe if you just told the whole story, they'd understand. And that's when Simona looked at me and said something that stopped that spiral cold. She said, "You don't know context to people who benefit from misunderstanding you." And it landed harder than anything else she'd ever said because it reframed the entire situation. It wasn't my job to correct their version of events. It was my job to live in a way that didn't require constant defense. And that clarity came just in time because a week later, my parents made their next move. They filed for grandparents' visitation, not because they missed Zoe, not because they wanted reconciliation, but because it was leverage, because nothing scares a mother faster than the threat of losing access to her child. And when I got the notice in the mail, my hand shook so badly I had to sit on the floor to open it. The words blurred together: petition, best interest, established relationship, and for a split second, fear surged so hard it felt like that night on the porch all over again, cold and breathless and powerless. And if you've ever been there, you know that fear doesn't ask logical questions. It just demands compliance. It tells you to fold, to appease, to give them what they want so the danger goes away. And that's exactly what they were counting on. But something had changed in me by then. Not courage exactly, but clarity, and clarity is steadier than courage. Clarity doesn't spike and crash. It just holds. So instead of panicking, I called a lawyer, not a dramatic one, not a scorched earth type, just someone calm and precise who listened to my story without interrupting and then asked me for documentation, dates, messages, witnesses. And when I told her about the lockout, the storm, the key being taken, the words my father used, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "That's not a gray area." And hearing that felt like someone finally naming the thing I'd been living inside for years. Because my whole childhood had been one long gray area where everything was debatable and deniable, and suddenly here was a professional saying, "No, that crosses a line," and we prepared, methodically, not emotionally. We gathered records, school forms, texts, police reports, anything that showed a pattern instead of a moment. And in the middle of all that, life kept happening. Zoe had a science project, I had exams, the grocery store changed my schedule. The world didn't pause just because my parents decided to retaliate, and somewhere in the middle of that chaos, I realized how different this fight felt compared to every conflict I'd had with them growing up, because this time, I wasn't alone. I wasn't a scared teenager being told I was lucky to have a roof over my head. I was a grown woman with support, documentation, and a child whose safety mattered more than anyone's pride. And halfway through all of this, I want to pause and ask you something, because stories like this don't live in a vacuum. Tell me where you're watching from, city, state, country, wherever you are, because this dynamic plays out in families everywhere, and the more we name it, the harder it is to hide. And back in my reality, the court date came faster than I expected. Fluorescent lights, hard benches, my parents sitting across the room pretending not to look at me while watching my every move. Savannah wasn't there, and that absence said more than any speech could have. My mother dabbed her eyes theatrically. My father stared straight ahead like he was attending a meeting he expected to control, and when it was time to speak, Their lawyer painted a picture of loving grandparents unfairly cut off by a resentful daughter. They talked about family bonds and misunderstandings and emotional reactions. And then it was my turn, and I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I didn't dramatize, I just told the truth in sequence. The way truth sounds when you're no longer afraid of it. I described the night they kicked us out, the storm, the key, the exact words used. The lack of concern for a 5-year-old child. I described the aftermath, the fear, the instability, the way they only reached out when there were consequences, and when the judge asked my parents why they hadn't contacted me to ensure Zoe's safety that night. My father hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than any answer he could have given. The petition was denied, not with a lecture, not with a moral judgment, but with a simple statement about the child's best interest and the parents' demonstrated behavior. And as we left the courthouse, my mother finally looked at me, really looked, and for a split second, I saw something flicker there, not remorse, but loss. The realization that the power she'd always assumed was permanent was gone, and I thought that would feel satisfying, like victory, but it didn't. It felt quiet, like closing a door you'd already emotionally left, and in the weeks that followed, the noise died down. No more calls, no more concern, no more attempts to reassert control through other people, and that silence felt different than before. It wasn't ominous, it was empty, and empty can be peaceful if you let it. I focused on my life, my studies, my work, Zoe's laughter filling spaces that used to echo, and slowly the story stopped being about what they did and started being about what I was building. But here's the thing about people who lose control: they don't always disappear. Sometimes they wait, sometimes they gather, sometimes they plan a final move that they believe will restore the balance in their favor, and I didn't know it yet, but my parents weren't finished. Not by a long shot, because the next time they showed up, it wouldn't be in a courtroom or a parking lot. It would be somewhere far more public, far more humiliating for them, and far more revealing of who they'd always been. And when that moment came, there would be no gray area left to hide in. The first thing people never tell you about betrayal is that it doesn't arrive loud. It arrives dressed as normal, smiling, sounding reasonable, pretending it's for your own good. And that's what made this part so dangerous, because by the time I realized what was happening, the ground had already shifted under my feet and everyone around me was acting like nothing had changed except me. Like I was the unstable variable in an otherwise healthy equation, and that messes with your head in a way screaming never could, because when your parents don't yell, when they don't hit, when they don't explode, but instead calmly rearrange your life and call it love, you start questioning your own reality. You start asking yourself whether pain only counts if it leaves bruises, whether abandonment is still abandonment if it's done politely. And this was the phase where I almost lost myself, not because I didn't fight back, but because I fought back alone while the referees were cheering for the other team and calling it fairness. And I need you to understand this clearly if you've lived something similar. Betrayal hurts more when it's framed as discipline, because now you're not just injured, you're guilty for bleeding. And back then, every single rule in that house only applied in one direction. Savannah could slam doors, cry loudly, demand space, demand money, demand forgiveness. But if I took up even one extra inch of emotional oxygen, I was selfish, dramatic, ungrateful, and the wild part is that nobody ever says these things outright. They drip feed them into you over years, so by the time you're pushed out into the cold, you're already half convinced you deserve it. And that's what I want you to sit with for a second. Because if you've ever been the problem child simply for existing differently, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And somewhere in the middle of this, right here, before the explosion, before the storm, before the door slammed shut for good, I need to ask you something real quick. And I don't want you to overthink it. Just answer honestly in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? Not for analytics, not for numbers, but because I want you to realize how many people are listening to this story thinking, that was me, from all over the world, because isolation thrives in silence, and this story refuses to stay quiet. Now back to it, because this was the stage where my parents perfected their favorite trick, rewriting history in real time. They'd say things like, "We've done everything for you. You've always been difficult. We've sacrificed so much." And notice the language. Everything was always vague, never specific, no examples, no dates, just broad emotional invoices I could never fully repay. And when I tried to defend myself, when I tried to point out the imbalance, the favoritism, the double standards, they'd sigh, that tired, disappointed sigh that says you're exhausting for even noticing. And suddenly the conversation wasn't about what they did. It was about my tone, my attitude, my inability to let things go. And if you've never experienced this, let me translate it plainly. It's like being robbed and then scolded for checking your pockets too loudly. And the more I tried to be reasonable, the more they treated me like I was unstable. And that's where the realization started creeping in, slow and terrifying, that this wasn't about fixing anything. This was about control, about maintaining a hierarchy where I stayed small and grateful and dependent. And Zoe's presence shattered that balance in a way they never forgave me for. Because children have a way of exposing truth without trying. A spilled cup, a question asked too honestly. A need that can't be postponed. And suddenly all the unspoken rules were threatened, and the resentment they carried for years finally found a trigger that felt justified. And that night, before the words were even spoken, before the sentence that still echoes in my chest, I remember looking around the house and realizing something terrifyingly clear. This place was never a home. It was a holding cell, and I had just overstayed my sentence. And here's the part people don't talk about enough. Betrayal doesn't always feel like anger at first. Sometimes it feels like grief for a fantasy you didn't even know you were still hoping for. The fantasy that one day they'd see you. That one day you'd earn unconditional love by being good enough, quiet enough, successful enough. And when that fantasy finally dies, it hurts worse than rage, because now there's nothing left to negotiate with, no finish line to run toward. And that's when survival mode quietly takes over. Your body knows before your mind does, your shoulders tighten, your thoughts narrow, your focus shifts from "how do I fix this" to "how do I protect my child?" And that shift is irreversible, because once you choose protection over approval, the old power structure collapses and they feel it, even if they can't name it. And that's exactly why what came next wasn't impulsive, it wasn't heat-of-the-moment cruelty. It was a decision that had been waiting for permission, and in the next stretch of the story, you're going to see how fast family values disappear when control slips through their fingers, how quickly love turns transactional, and how the people who preached loyalty the loudest were the first to revoke it. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't just painful, it's revealing, and I promise you, if you've ever been told to be grateful for being mistreated, what comes next is going to hit deep. The night after the door closed behind us didn't feel dramatic the way movies train you to expect betrayal to feel. There were no monologues or swelling music. It felt quiet and unfinished, like the world had hit pause while my body was still running. And that dissonance is what made it unbearable, because when you're thrown out by the people who are supposed to catch you, there's no script for what comes next. Only instincts you didn't know you had, and that night, every instinct in me sharpened around one truth. Zoe could not be allowed to believe what they said, not even for a second, not even in her sleep, because kids don't just hear words, they absorb meaning, and the meaning of mistake is poison if it settles too early. So while the car idled and the storm swallowed the road, my brain was doing two things at once: cataloging immediate survival needs and replaying every moment that led here like a courtroom highlight reel. And that's when the pattern snapped into focus. With terrifying clarity, this wasn't about orange juice. It wasn't about noise or mess or respect. It was about hierarchy, and the second I stopped being controllable, the second my life complicated their narrative of order, they chose expulsion over adjustment, which tells you everything you need to know about how conditional their love always was. And if you've ever been the family scapegoat, you already recognize this moment. The moment where confusion gives way to grim understanding, where you realize you weren't unlucky, you were assigned a role, and your job was to absorb blame so everyone else could feel balanced. And the wild thing is how fast your body adapts once the truth lands. The panic didn't disappear, but it organized itself. My thoughts stopped spiraling and started sequencing: heat first, shelter second, food third, money fourth, pride nowhere on the list. And I remember thinking how strange it was that clarity arrived only after rejection, like my nervous system had been waiting for permission to stop hoping. And in that space between fear and focus, another realization crept in, quieter but just as heavy. They expected me to come back. Not that night maybe, but eventually. They expected remorse, apologies, bargaining, because that's how the cycle always worked. They applied pressure, I folded, order restored, and breaking that cycle is what scared them more than any spill ever could. And as the miles passed under the tires and Zoe finally slept from exhaustion, I understood that the punishment wasn't exile. Exile was the threat. The real punishment was supposed to be my return. And that's when resolve hardened into something new. Not anger, not revenge, but refusal, a simple internal no that didn't need to be announced to be real. And I need you to hear this part closely, because it matters later. refusing to return to harm doesn't mean you're strong every moment. It means you're done negotiating with people who only change the terms, and the road eventually led us to a place that wasn't ideal but was enough. A room that smelled like old carpet and disinfectant, a heater that rattled like it might quit at any moment, and a bed that sagged in the middle. But it had a door that locked from the inside, and that mattered more than comfort. And as Zoe slept curled against my side, I stared at the ceiling and let the weight of the day settle. The shock, the grief, the relief. Because, yes, there was relief too, and admitting that feels almost shameful until you realize how much energy it takes to survive constant emotional threat. And that's when the intrusive thoughts started lining up like hecklers. Maybe they were right. Maybe I failed. Maybe this is what happens when you don't follow the rules, and I let them speak without agreeing, because growth sometimes looks like listening to the old voice without obeying it. And somewhere in the middle of that mental chaos, I want to pause for just a second and ask you something. Because stories like this only stay heavy when we pretend they're rare. So tell me in the comments. Where you're watching from right now, city or country, doesn't matter. I want you to see how many people are carrying versions of this pain in different places, because isolation feeds shame and shame feeds silence. And we're not doing that here. Now back to that night, because the morning after was worse in a different way. Daylight has a way of making cruelty undeniable. At night you can tell yourself people were tired or emotional. But in the morning what happened is still true, and now it's fully lit. And when my phone buzzed, it wasn't with concern or regret. It was with logistics disguised as generosity. Messages that said things like, when you're ready to talk, or let's not make this bigger than it is, which is code for please return to the role we assigned you, so we don't have to feel this discomfort. And I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I was learning something new. Silence isn't cruelty when it's protection. And that distinction matters more than most people admit, because toxic systems rely on access. They rely on you explaining, justifying, engaging, and every response becomes a lever they can pull, and cutting access feels radical until you realize it's the only language some people understand. And as days turned into weeks, the practical consequences started stacking: new routines, new calculations, new fears, but also new competence. I learned I could handle more than I'd been allowed to believe. I learned Zoe watched everything and mirrored resilience faster than pain when she felt safe. I learned that being tired from honest effort hurts less than being tired from walking on eggshells. And here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. The fallout didn't come from me leaving. It came from me not crawling back, because when I didn't return begging for forgiveness, the narrative cracked. Relatives started asking questions. The version of events they'd rehearsed didn't land the same without my cooperation. And suddenly I was being accused of holding grudges, of tearing the family apart, of making things awkward, which is always what happens when the designated absorber of dysfunction steps out of line. And notice the irony. The people who threw a child into a storm over a stain on carpet suddenly cared deeply about harmony. And that hypocrisy is the kind that makes your hands shake when you finally name it, because it reveals how morality in dysfunctional families is often just a tool for compliance. And the more I held my boundary, the louder the pressure became. Guilt wrapped in nostalgia, apologies that never quite included accountability, offers of help that came with strings attached, and each time I felt the pull, I went back to one image: Zoe asking if it was her fault, because boundaries get easier when you remember who you're protecting. And if you're wondering where the anger went, it didn't disappear, it transformed. Anger matured into discernment, and discernment is quieter but far more dangerous to systems built on control, because it doesn't need to shout to be effective. And that's when something unexpected happened. People started telling me their own stories, whispered confessions from cousins, neighbors, even strangers, stories of favoritism, conditional love, emotional eviction long before physical eviction. And I realized this wasn't just my story. It was a pattern repeating itself in countless households, and patterns only survive when they're unnamed. So naming it became an act of rebellion, and in the next stretch of this journey, the consequences of that rebellion are going to escalate in ways I didn't anticipate, because when you stop playing your assigned role, the entire system scrambles to correct you. And the next move they made wasn't about reconciliation, it was about reputation, and that's where things get even messier, so stay with me, because what happens next exposes not just personal betrayal, but how far people will go to protect the image of being good parents, even if it means burning the child they already discarded. By the time the backlash shifted from private guilt to public performance, I understood something that took years to articulate. Families like mine don't fear losing you. They fear losing the story about you because the story is what keeps the hierarchy intact. And once I refuse to come back quietly, they move to the next phase, narrative control, which is when truth becomes inconvenient and image becomes everything. And it started subtly at first, comments relayed through third parties about concern for Zoe's stability, questions framed as worry that somehow suggested I was reckless for leaving without support, even though the leaving was forced, even though the support was never offered without a price. And what struck me wasn't the cruelty, it was the choreography, how quickly everyone seemed to know their lines, how concern was deployed like a costume. Because when people who've benefited from your silence realize you're done being quiet, they don't apologize, they reposition. And the repositioning was fast, whispers about whether I was overwhelmed, hints that maybe I'd exaggerated what happened, questions about my mental state that pretended to care while laying groundwork. And if you've lived this, you know exactly what I mean. It's the moment you realize the danger isn't the people who hate you openly. It's the ones who smile and say they're just worried while sharpening something behind their back. And the reason this part matters is because it's where many people fold, not because they're weak, but because reputational warfare feels abstract until it isn't, until it threatens custody, employment, friendships, until it turns your private pain into public speculation. And when that shift happened, I had a choice to make that terrified me more than sleeping in a car ever did. I could stay small and hope the storm passed, or I could get ahead of it by owning the truth out loud, consequences included, and that decision wasn't brave in the cinematic sense. It was pragmatic, because silence had never protected me before, and something else was happening in parallel that I didn't fully grasp until later. Zoe was watching how adults respond when they're wronged. She was absorbing lessons about self-respect the way kids do, not through lectures but through behavior. And every time I ignored a baiting message or refused to engage in a circular argument, she learned that peace doesn't require permission, and that knowledge felt heavier than any fear they could throw at me. So when the first official-looking envelope arrived, my hands shook, but my mind stayed clear. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was worse in a way. It was a letter requesting mediation, couched in language about family healing and best interests, which sounds benevolent until you read it closely and realize it's an attempt to recast abuse as misunderstanding and boundaries as hostility. And the subtext was unmistakable. Come back to the table on our terms or we escalate. And escalation is a powerful word when you're a single parent with limited resources. It's designed to make you doubt your footing, to make you second-guess your memory, to make you wonder if fighting is worth the cost. And that night I sat on the edge of the bed long after Zoe fell asleep and let myself feel the fear fully instead of pushing it away. Because fear loses some of its power when you name it, and what I named was this: I wasn't afraid of losing. I was afraid of being misrepresented, of having my reality edited by people who had already proven they didn't see me as fully human. And that's when preparation replaced panic, documentation replaced denial. I started writing everything down, dates, messages, exact phrasing, not because I planned to weaponize it, but because clarity is armor. And as I gathered facts, something surprising happened. The fog lifted even more. Patterns emerged that I couldn't unsee, moments from years ago that suddenly made sense. The way rules only applied to me, the way my accomplishments were minimized while my mistakes were magnified, the way affection was offered in exchange for compliance. And recognizing a pattern is different from remembering an incident. It shifts the question from what did I do wrong to what system was I trapped in. And that reframing is liberating in a way that's hard to explain until you feel it, because it takes the shame out of your bones and puts it where it belongs, outside you. And right here in the middle, I want to pause again, because this is the point in the story where many of you are nodding along quietly. So tell me where you're watching from, state or country, because the geography changes but the dynamics don't. And seeing how widespread this is breaks the illusion that it's personal failure instead of structural dysfunction. Now back to the escalation, because once they realized I wasn't coming back quietly and I wasn't panicking publicly, they made a miscalculation. They underestimated how much credibility they'd lost by choosing cruelty in a moment that left witnesses, because word travels faster than control in the age of receipts. And when people asked me directly what happened, I told the truth without embellishment, not to punish, but to stop carrying their secret, and the effect was immediate and unexpected. The sympathy they'd been farming dried up, the concern turned awkward, and suddenly, I wasn't the unstable one. I was the composed one answering simple questions with consistent facts, and consistency is devastating to liars because it leaves no cracks to exploit, and this is where the satisfaction comes in, not the petty kind, the grounded kind that comes from realizing you're no longer fighting for approval, you're standing on principle, and principle attracts allies quietly at first, a neighbor who offered childcare, a coworker who vouched for my reliability, a relative who reached out privately to say they'd suspected something for years, and each small show of support rebuilt a piece of trust one didn't realize had been eroded, trust in myself, and the mediation request eventually went nowhere because mediation requires good faith, and good faith is impossible when one side refuses accountability, but the attempt itself revealed something critical. They were no longer trying to get me back. They were trying to manage fallout, and that distinction matters because it tells you when a relationship has crossed from reparable to performative, and once I saw that clearly the grief changed shape. It became quieter, less acute, more like a scar than a wound. And scars are strange because they remind you of pain but also of survival, and in the months that followed life didn't become easy, but it became honest, routine stabilized, finances slowly improved, Zoe laughed more freely, slept more soundly, asked fewer anxious questions, and the house felt like a place instead of a checkpoint. And that's when I realized the final truth of this chapter. The revenge wasn't success or exposure or vindication. It was peace. The kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that grows in the absence of chaos. And that peace terrified them more than anger ever could because it meant I was unreachable. And if you think that's the end, you'd be wrong, because the last move they made wasn't legal or loud. It was emotional. A message that arrived without warning and carried a confession I didn't expect. A confession that reframed everything yet again and forced me to decide what closure really looks like. And that decision, more than the night in the storm or the weeks of scrambling, is where the story truly resolves. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't about them at all. It's about what happens when the person you used to be finally catches up to the person you've become and asks for something you're not sure you can give. The message came late at night, which is always how truth arrives when it's been sitting under weight for too long. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a notification lighting up the dark like it's unsure whether it's allowed to exist. And I stared at the screen longer than I want to admit, because by then I'd learned that silence from them was safer than contact. But contact meant something unresolved was trying to breathe, and the words were short, almost careful, which made them more dangerous than rage ever was. It said, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how, and I don't expect forgiveness. And my first instinct was to protect the life I'd built by not opening it at all, because peace is fragile in its early stages and you don't throw open windows during a storm just because someone knocks politely. But the second instinct was quieter and harder to ignore. It said, if you don't read this now, it will live in the background forever. So I sat down, put the phone face up on the table, took a breath that went all the way into my ribs, and opened it. And what followed wasn't an apology in the way movies teach us to expect. It wasn't remorse wrapped in self-awareness and neat accountability. It was fragmented, defensive in places, sincere in others, and painfully human in a way that made my chest ache despite everything. It talked about fear, not of losing me, but of losing control, about how they'd always believed authority equaled love and obedience equaled safety, about how they never learned another language for care. And here's the part that stopped my breath. It admitted they'd known for years that what they were doing was wrong, but changing would have required admitting they'd failed as parents, and that admission felt worse to them than losing a child. And if you've lived this kind of betrayal, you know how destabilizing that sentence is, because it confirms what you suspected but hoped wasn't true, that the harm wasn't ignorance, it was choice. And I didn't cry when I read it. Not then. My body had learned to delay reaction until it felt safe. Instead, I sat very still and felt something settle. Not relief, not anger, resolution, the kind that closes a loop quietly because that message didn't reopen wounds, it cauterized them. It gave shape to the truth I'd been circling for years, that I could understand their damage without sacrificing my boundaries. And that understanding doesn't obligate reconciliation. And this is where the story turns from survival to authorship, because I realized the final decision wasn't whether to forgive them, It was whether to re-enter a dynamic that required me to be smaller than I am, and that answer came not from logic but from looking at my child asleep down the hall, breathing evenly in a house that finally felt like home, and knowing that whatever model I choose now becomes her blueprint later. And before I tell you what I chose, I want to pause right here, because this is the moment where everyone watching has a different instinct. Some of you would reopen the door, some of you would burn the bridge, some of you are still standing in the doorway unsure which way leads to peace. So tell me where you're watching from right now, because the way culture frames family obligation shapes these decisions more than we admit, and knowing you're not alone in this crossroads matters. Now back to the choice, because the choice wasn't dramatic, it wasn't announced, it wasn't delivered with finality, it was a response measured in tone and intention. I replied that I appreciated the honesty, that I understood more than they realized, and that understanding didn't change my boundary. That contact would remain limited and conditional, not as punishment but as protection, and I wished them well without offering access. And when I hit send, my hands didn't shake, which is how I knew it was right, because fear had been replaced by clarity, and what followed wasn't retaliation or collapse. It was quiet. Weeks passed without messages, without pressure, without performance, and in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I grieved. Not the parents I had, but the parents I never would. And grief is strange when it arrives after safety. It's softer but deeper. It doesn't knock you over. It sits beside you and asks to be acknowledged. And I let it. I let myself mourn the fantasy of being chosen, of being protected without cost, of being loved without conditions. And mourning that fantasy made room for gratitude for the reality I'd built. Friendships that showed up without scorekeeping. Work that valued contribution over compliance, a home where mistakes were handled with repair instead of exile, and as months turned into a year, the story stopped being about them entirely. It became about integration, about taking the parts of myself that had been frozen in survival mode and letting them thaw, learning what rest feels like when it isn't stolen, learning how to say no without apology, learning that peace doesn't require explanation. And there were moments of doubt, of course. Birthdays that passed quietly, holidays that felt oddly spacious, times when the absence echoed louder than any argument ever had. But each time I checked in with myself, the answer was the same. This is what alignment feels like, not constant happiness, but internal agreement. And here's the thing no one tells you about walking away from people who hurt you. The world doesn't end, it expands. Opportunities appear that couldn't fit in the old container. Relationships deepen because they're not competing with chaos. Creativity returns because it's not being used solely for coping, and one day you realize you're no longer explaining your past to justify your present. You're just living, and that's the real reckoning. Not confrontation, not exposure, not revenge, but irrelevance, becoming someone who no longer needs the approval of people who couldn't see your worth. And if you're waiting for a cinematic payoff where they apologize perfectly and everything resolves neatly, I won't lie to you, that rarely happens, but something better can. You can become so rooted in who you are that their perspective loses gravity, and when that happens, you stop orbiting their damage, you step into your own trajectory, and that's what I want you to take from this. Not permission to cut people off recklessly, not validation for avoidance, but clarity about patterns, about choice, about the cost of staying versus the cost of leaving, because loyalty that demands self-erasure isn't loyalty, it's captivity, and love that punishes honesty isn't love, it's control. And if you're watching this and feeling that familiar knot in your stomach, that recognition that something in your life mirrors this dynamic, hear me clearly. You're not weak for noticing, you're not dramatic for naming it, and you're not cruel for choosing yourself. The end of this story isn't me standing over anyone else. It's me standing firmly in my own life. And if you want to keep walking with stories like this, stories about breaking cycles, reclaiming identity, and building something better from the wreckage, the next video dives even deeper into what happens after the boundary holds, after the guilt fades, after you realize you're allowed to be whole. So stay with me, because the most powerful chapter always comes after you stop trying to prove your pain and start protecting your peace.